Martin, so about your one of your last play is called Scream Queer Murder, and is basically inspired by the world and the novels by Agatha Christie, and specifically by some characters that appears in Agatha Christie's work. How did you come up with the idea for this specific play?
Well, like many ideas for plays, it started accidentally. I happened to be visiting an area of the country where Agatha Christie was born, in Devon, in the southwest of England, and particularly a place called Paynton, which she was born next door to Paynton in Torquay. And it set me thinking about whether it might be possible to write a play with a hidden history of the gay characters, which undoubtedly are in her books, but which are never really spelled out because of the time that the books were written. Although in some recent television adaptations and so on, occasionally I think gay characters have been made more prominent. But at the time she wrote, being gay was very much a hidden history. It was a hidden event. I also discovered that a good friend of mine, Julius Green, was an expert on Agatha Christie, particularly on her plays, and that he spoke every year at an Agatha Christie festival. And each year there is the International Agatha Christie Festival in Torquay and Paynton in Devon. So I set myself the aim of writing a play which I would persuade the festival to put on, which eventually I did.
What do you mean specifically, before the second question, what do you mean with the hidden history? So that is a topic that is of a great interest in your career.
It is in my work, and it doesn't just apply to gay things, but a lot of the work I've done in recent years has had a gay subtext, coming from the fact that I actually came into the gay world many years ago now, but I lived a lot of my life as a married man with children. I still have children, and when I came into the gay world, it took over my imagination. I was coming into a world I didn't know, and a lot of what I've written since then has been about that. And what I have discovered, which is fairly obvious really, is that gay people in many, many ways, although they have been often prominent artists and musicians and everything else, gay people in general have been hidden from history. Their lives have not really been talked about, or if they have been talked about, they've been twisted in various ways. And so what interested me was to try and reclaim some of these histories. So I've written a play about the composer Handel, who was almost certainly gay. I've written, as you will know, something about the Melville novel, Billy Budd Sailor, which tries to reclaim the gay, very obviously gay subtext of that novel, which is often hidden. And with Agatha Christie and Scream Queer Murder, I started off by looking at the characters in her work and whether they might have been gay and how she treated this. The final work isn't directly about characters in Agatha Christie's plays. I've made it broader than that. It's about a murder mystery writer. Okay, we performed it in the International Agatha Christie Festival, so it's not a million miles from her. But it is a more general point about the way novels that were written in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and so on, the gay characters were not referred to as gay and were very stereotypical in many ways. Not always in an unpleasant way, sometimes so, but not always in an unpleasant way. And also, of course, stereotypes do have some relation to the truth. So, for example, in Agatha Christie and other murder mystery writers, certain professions, certain jobs were often seen as gay professions. Antique dealers were particularly suspect. Arts dealers the same. Art critics, possibly even more. Dancers, fairly obviously, were assumed by the general public to be gay. That is very much the case of the characters who have what you might call gay characteristics in her novels. Often these characters were characters who betrayed emotions. If a man cried in a murder mystery, that would be telling you something about him. In other words, if he had unmanly characteristics. I'm talking mainly about men here, and the play I wrote was about two men, although the female murder mystery writer appears as well. But those characteristics, I said, were basically men who had unmanly characteristics. But what that also meant was, because these were unacceptable characteristics for the time the novels were written, it probably never occurred to her to make them the main characters. In other words, a lot of these characters were the minor characters in the books and plays. Now, this leaves a big question, which people have very differing opinions on, and which my play wasn't about, which was her two most famous characters, which were Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot. Some people could argue that both of them, being single, could well have been gay. People hotly contest, particularly with Poirot, that he wasn't, perhaps less so with Miss Marple. But that wasn't so much what my play was about. My play was about the minor characters in the play who have these gay characteristics without ever being called gay. And in my play, they suddenly find themselves taking center stage. Can
I ask you something about your play? I know that you work a lot on a specific language that you use, because I think you use also the Polari language for your play. So how did you work on this language?
Well, there are two aspects to it. Polari is a language that was used in the 50s particularly, but at other times as well, and largely by gay men. It's not just used by it, it has traditions in circus and in the sea, but became associated with gay men. And during the 50s particularly, what it was a way of gay men communicating amongst themselves, but also keeping safe. So if they fancied a man across the pub, they actually spoke about him in Polari, so the other men in the pub wouldn't get upset. And this almost became a public thing. The famous English actor and comedian Kenneth Williams, on the radio in the 50s and 60s, he and his fellow actor Hugh Paddick played a couple called Julian and Sandy, who spoke in Polari on the main British radio station. And it was all a jolly good joke, and everybody knew that they were gay, but it was never ever said. And this was true also at that time of a lot of comedians. A lot of comedians very much camped up their acts to make everybody in the world know that they were gay, but it was never ever said, and couldn't and wouldn't have been said. So this language, Polari, is a fascinating language. It's become written about more lately. A man brought out, I've got him here, Paul Baker brought out a book called Fabulosa last year or the year before last, I think. Very much a Polari word. So you don't say fabulous, you say fabulosa. One of the most famous quotes in Polari is, instead of saying, how are you? You say, bona tavada, your dolly old eek. Bona tavada means good to see. Your dolly old eek means your pretty face. Bona tavada, your dolly old eek. It's not a huge language in terms of numbers of words, but it's a fascinating thing, and it is based completely in reality. And I actually used it as part of my play to fool the writer. what happens in my play is that the two men are actually being written as the play progresses. The conceit of the play, and indeed what made it work for me when it first started, was that I suddenly thought of these two male characters I'd invented of being written inside the head of the writer. And as the play progresses, they are written more and more, and because they end up as the only two characters in the play, they become suspicious of each other. As if we're in a murder mystery and there are only two characters, one of them's got to kill the other, or that's what they think. It becomes a bit more complicated than that in the play. But what happens is they end up fighting the writer, who we do see in the play, or two writers we see in the play, in fact. And their way of fooling the writer is to start talking in Polari. It's a bit like something in the play I've recently done about Dante and Dali, in that one has to make sure an audience can understand this. In the Dante Dali play, I speak in 3 languages, and I have yet to find out whether everybody will understand it. In the Agatha Christie, it has to be done in such a way that the audience understand what's going on. But when we performed it, no one suggested they didn't.
How was the reaction at the Agatha Christie Festival?
It went down very well, the Agatha Christie Festival. It's a smallish festival. It was only performed once, and we had great plans to tour it, but then COVID took over and everything stopped for the last year or more. But it was very, very much liked, I think. We had actually done a tryout of it in there's a very nice theatre in that part of the world called the Palace Theatre Paynton. And that has a big amateur theatre company that does Agatha Christie plays on a very regular basis because of where it is. And we had 200 of them turn up for our tryout. Very few of them stayed behind to say what they thought. The few who did were quite nice. I think they hadn't quite seen anything like it before. It's not quite done in the traditional way. And I think they were particularly shocked that the conceit of the play is that we start with nothing on the stage, and then slowly the set is built up as the characters and the plots are written inside our head. But I was told that there was a gasp of horror when the curtain went up and there was nothing on the stage at all. So it was challenging, but I think they liked it. In the festival itself, the play went down very well, and we do hope that at some point in the future we will tour it around the UK, or indeed anywhere else. By its nature, it has quite a strong plot, so it would translate into other languages. So I'd be very interested in hearing from anybody who liked the idea and was willing to do the play somewhere else.
My last question is about the play itself, because usually in the last years you worked a lot in writing and performing and staging one performer show, so solo performance. How was write again a play for multiple characters and multiple performers?
Well, there were multiple characters. So, of course, in my one-man shows, I had play lots of characters. I do a one-man version of The Tempest, where I play all the characters. So the multiple characters wasn't so much of a problem to me. And there are only 3 characters. It was not a lot different, to be really honest. A lot of the work I've been doing has been on these sort of subjects: hidden histories, gay characters. I had a very good cast to work with, and it was more difficult to perform, to be honest. I have performed in many plays with very large numbers of characters over the years, but because for the last, I suppose, 10 years, I have mainly been doing one-man shows, it's a bit of a shock to the system. It may seem a strange thing to say, but it's harder to perform in a 3-hander than it is to perform on your own. Something about if you're there, you can. It sounds rather cheap to say you can make it up, but you can always get through it if there's just you. If there's other characters on the stage, it's hard work.
Thank you a lot, Martin, for this wonderful conversation about your work on Agatha Christie. Thank you a lot also for your activity and for the play. You know that I consider your works very beautiful, and personally I feel that you're one of the really most interesting storyteller I met in my career, in my activity as a critic and academic. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. Good.